So I'm going to talk a lot about these bad boys. What can you tell me about them? Yeah? They're big tombs for kings, yes. They were very, very important in the whole spiritual life of the Egyptians, because one of the outstanding features of the ancient Egyptian culture is that they placed more value on the afterlife than on the present life. Everything they did was oriented toward having a good afterlife. For example, you don't find any kings, pharaohs' palaces from this epoch because they made them out of the cheap stuff. They saved the good stuff for the tombs. Okay? What else can you tell me? Very good, yes. So what you're seeing here is the present day appearance, of course. And you can see, especially on this one, that the surface is quite rough. This is the rough coarse limestone that makes up the bulk of the building. And by the way, just so you know how extraordinary these buildings are, these are still, by volume of building material used, the largest buildings in the world. Because they're solid stone. They're not shells. They're filled with stone. That's the only way they could stand up. So about the white limestone casing, well, on the middle one, so these are three pyramids from three successive pharaohs. Actually, I think there might have been one that was skipped over. But Khufu is the oldest one, Khafre, and then Menkaure. And actually, Khufu's is the biggest. It doesn't appear this way from the perspective. And Menkaure is the smallest. Now, in the middle one, you can see there's a little bit left up near the top of what used to come all the way down. But that's still relatively coarse stone compared to the original appearance, which was, it was completely covered in very fine, beautiful white limestone. So these things would have looked even more unreal when they were originally built. And I'll tell you how that limestone came to be lost later on. What else can you tell me? Yes? In front of Menkaure's, there's a little one, yes. That might have been used for one of the queens or a prince, something like that. All right, I said they're big, right? 280 cubits high, 440 cubits wide at the base. What's a cubit? A cubit is the length from your elbow to your fingertips. It's about 1.5 feet. So 440 cubits is about 220 yards, 2 football fields across at the base. And these are laid out with extraordinary precision so that the sides are perfectly aligned north-south, east-west. It's very important for the astronomical function of these monuments. And they're said to have understandably taken quite a lot of labor and time to build. Herodotus, anyone know who Herodotus was? What country he came from? Greece. He was the first person who took it upon himself to visit other countries, ask them what their history was, and write it down. So in effect, he was the first historian. He's also known to have been sometimes pretty uncritical of what they told him. So in addition to being known as the father of history, he's sometimes referred to as the father of lies. But he visited Egypt and was told that 100,000 men worked for 20 years to build just the first one. Okay? Modern day estimates, maybe you wouldn't have taken quite that many. You might have done it with 30 or 40,000 people over 20 years. And the date around 2600 BC, and that's an interesting story in itself. The astronomy is going to give us a better date than any archaeological evidence. Okay, so you've got a big contest here. The ancient contest is, who is first, Sumer or Egypt? Well, they were both first, okay? But in some aspects, we have better evidence in terms of the monuments because they're made of hard stone. And there's a reason. It's not just because the Sumerians didn't bother to use hard stone. They used clay bricks. They didn't really have it because what happens is right along the Red Sea is where two large tectonic plates come together. And that involves a lot of crushing and grinding, and the result is that it's relatively easy to find hard stone. And that is why these things survive. Here is an example, by the way, of a very hard stone. It's called dolerite. It's in the shape of a ball. It was probably used for finishing the blocks. But I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. Okay, so here we have, right down at the bottom, a little bit of the remains of the white outer casing. All right? And what happened to that was that in 1303 CE, Common Era, there was an earthquake in Cairo that leveled everything, except, of course, the pyramids. You don't level the pyramids. After they rebuilt after this earthquake, they decided that it wasn't worth the trouble to try to mine more white limestone when they had these beautiful mining pits. All the blocks were there. They just had to take them, and that's what they did. The Sultan Hassan Mosque, which is one of the most famous mosques in Cairo, is entirely built from stones taken from the casing of the pyramid. Now, the pyramids at Giza were not the first Egyptian pyramids. What probably deserves that name, first Egyptian pyramid, or world's first pyramid, was a little bit further down the river at Saqqara. Here's Giza, here's Cairo, here's the river. Giza, Saqqara, Dashur is another place where you find tombs and monuments. Anyone notice anything about those three locations? Sorry? They're all on near the river, and in particular, they're all on the west bank, because the west is the direction of the setting sun. So that's where you would want the monument to be. Okay? So before Khufu's pyramid was even begun, a much earlier, well, somewhat earlier pharaoh named Djoser. Well, up at the top is another Egyptian form of his name. I'm not even going to try that one. But Djoser had a grand vizier named Imhotep. And Imhotep ran the whole shop for the pharaoh. And in particular, he was in charge of monument building. And Imhotep was the first person who figured out how to build monuments out of hard stone. It's not easy, but he figured it out. Just shaping the blocks is quite a task. We actually don't know how they did it. And I'll tell you more about that. But Imhotep figured out how to build with hard stone, And one of the features of this pyramid, well, first of all, there is a burial chamber, and it's where you kind of expect it to be. It's in the ground underneath the pyramid, okay? Before they did anything, they cut a shaft down into the ground where the burial chamber was going to be, and then they built the whole pyramid on top of it. And they actually built it in stages. First, they put just the first layer, and then later they added successive layers to make it what you see here, which we call a step pyramid. It's the steps that you see are not because stuff's been taken away. It was meant to be that way. I mean, there is stuff that's fallen away, but it was meant to be a stair-step shape up the sides. Now, an important feature of Djoser's step pyramid at Saqqara is the serdab, which is on the north side of the pyramid, just outside. It's a little closet with a wall built around it, a statue inside it, and the statue is looking at a hole in the wall so it can see the chamber beyond. This is the Ka statue, K-A, Ka statue of Djoser. So now we need to know a little bit about what Egyptians believed about the afterlife. They believed that there was not just one soul, there were many components of the soul. But the two most prominent ones were the Ba, B-A, which is your personality. It's the things that make you who you are, okay? And another very important part of it is the Ka, K-A, and that's the vital force, the breath of life. It's what goes out of you when you die, okay? You might relate it to the Chinese concept of qi, vital force, okay? So when the body dies, the first thing that happens is the Ka goes out, and it's supposed to go out through the mouth, and there's a ceremony called the opening of the mouth to make sure it has no trouble getting out. And the other thing is that the Ba separates from the soul and also goes off. The hieroglyph for the Ka is the upright raised arms, see up in the corner. The hieroglyph for the Ba is often a bird with a human head on it, okay? And here's what's meant to happen. The Ba and the Ka leave the body. But the Egyptians believed that in order to have a successful life, afterlife, they had to come together again. And they had to come together around the original body, or the mummy. That's what the mummy was about. It was about making a meeting place for the Ba and the Ka. Now, as best I can understand it, it's not necessarily that everything goes back in and you're like you were alive. In fact, it's not clear that the Ba and Ka actually go into the mummy. They just need the mummy as a reference point. And in addition to that, the Ba and the Ka reunited around the mummy need all the things that you needed in your forelife. Food, water, entertainment, clothes, cosmetics. You need all these things to be buried with you in the burial chamber so that when the Ba and the Ka get back together, they can enjoy the afterlife, okay? Now, again, it's kind of subtle because, say you put an orange in the tomb. Well, the Ka of the Pharaoh wouldn't eat the orange he would eat the ka of the orange. Okay? He would take the vital force from the orange. He wouldn't actually eat it. He would take its vital force. Okay? So it's a kind of interesting situation. And I'll just say right now, the reason the Serdab Ka statue is facing north because he's facing the part of the sky that has the pole star and the stars that circle around it. Okay? And within a certain radius of the pole star, depending on where you are on Earth, it can be bigger or smaller, but it's fairly big where we are and where Egypt is. There's a circle of stars that never set. They go around and around, but they never get down to the horizon. They're always above the horizon during the night. And so the Egyptians quite naturally thought that these were the imperishables, and that this would be the first destination of the pharaoh's souls after they left the body. And so this is kind of a guidepost showing the way to go and lighting a lamp to come back. Okay? Again, it's not that the Ba and the Ka make the statue come alive. They don't go into the statue, but they need the statue. Okay. So now we're on to the Great Pyramid at Giza, the first one that was built by the pharaoh Khufu, or we sometimes call him Cheops. And this has a very interesting and completely unique arrangement because the burial chambers are actually inside the volume of the pyramid. They're not in the basement. Every other one that has a burial chamber, it's below the building. This one is not. It's in the building. Okay? So when they were piling up stones, they had to leave space for the king's chamber, the queen's chamber, passageways to get to them, and then some very narrow shafts, which have a relation. This is where we get our relation to astronomy now. So, again, here's Herodotus, the father of lies. He was fooled by this because he thought, he believed what everyone told him, which was the tomb was underneath. And so Khufu's deception succeeded even with Herodotus, the first historian. Now, these shafts are quite narrow. They're like about this big, okay? No way anybody's crawling in these narrow shafts. You can crawl in these, and then this one is quite grand. It's called the Grand Gallery leading up to. But those narrow shafts are quite small, and they have a specific guiding function, okay? Because one side of the pyramid is facing directly north. Remember, the pyramid is perfectly aligned. Well, not perfect. I think it's off by about 2 inches in 220 yards. That's how good they were. You'd have a hard time doing that well today. Perfectly aligned so that the shafts on the north side point to the stars around the poles. And likewise, on the south side, they go up, and those are going to point to stars that are seasonal, okay? Sometimes they appear and sometimes they don't appear during the night. They don't go away, they just, at other times they're coming up during the day so you don't realize it, okay? The upper one points to the belt stars of Orion. Who knows how to find Orion? Who's seen Orion? Raise your hands. Yeah? Okay. Show your friends. It's the easiest constellation to recognize. We'll show you a picture because of the 3 belt stars right in a row. Okay? So the top shaft points to the belt stars of Orion. The bottom points to a star that's near Orion, a little bit below and to the left, called Sirius. We call it Sirius. It's the brightest star in the sky. And we don't know a whole lot about how Egyptians understood constellations, but 2 things we're absolutely sure of. What we call Orion was to them the god Osiris. What we call Sirius was to them his queen Isis. Okay? Now, all of this about the inside was apparently completely unknown until about 820 in the Common Era, when Mamun, he was the 2nd caliph of the caliphate in Baghdad, okay, the Islamic Empire. He was the head of it. And he took an interest in the pyramids. And it's very interesting to note that his interest was not in gold or treasure. He thought that there was secret knowledge inside the pyramids, and that's what he wanted. Okay? Keep in mind, one of the defining features of the Islamic Empire, whenever they conquered a place, what did they ask for? Give us your gold, give us your women. What did they ask for? Give us your books. Give us your books. We'll just borrow them and copy them and give them back to you, but we want to see them. Give us your books. Well, of course, what they handed back was the copies. They kept the originals, but that was it. Give us your books. That was what they wanted above all, was knowledge. And that's what Mamun was after when he organized an expedition to try to get inside the pyramids. And so first he looked for if there was any entrance, and he sort of made a guess where it might be on the north face, part way up. And he missed by a little bit. Now we know that the real entrance is here, but he tried here and he tried burrowing in, and it was not an easy task. Now limestone, there's 2 stones involved in building the pyramids, actually 3, limestone and granite, and fine limestone and coarse limestone. Most of it is coarse limestone. The outer casing is fine limestone. But the key internal structures, including the entire interior walls of the king's chamber, are made of granite. Okay? How hard is granite? Okay? Limestone is already hard enough that you can't use copper. Copper is not as hard as limestone. You try to chisel limestone with a copper chisel, you'll do more damage to the chisel than you will to the stone. Okay? We have absolutely no evidence that anyone in the area had any harder metal, namely iron, until at least 1,000 years later. So what did they do? There's all kinds of guesses. They used a very hard fibrous spring, and then they put sand crystals in the groove, and maybe. We have no evidence of that. The only thing we have evidence is those dolerite balls, which could have been used to finally shape the blocks. And they are so well shaped, you cannot slip a piece of paper in between 2 blocks. Okay? But how they cut the stones originally, no idea. Okay, so he's got steel now, but it's still a very arduous process. What he has to do is heat the limestone up extremely hot, then he throws cold acid on it to crack it, and then he goes at it with a chisel for a few inches. And then same thing, heat it up red hot, throw cold acid on it, and get another couple of inches. Okay? So that's the way he started going in. And at a certain point, he connected with this descending passage. The story goes that they were off in the middle of the rocks, that they're looking for the actual entrance, and somebody heard a noise that sounded like a stone falling, and it came from over there, so we'll go over there, and then they found the descending passage. And being influenced by the stories that Khufu had put out, they thought this was the place. We're going down under the pyramid to the tomb. And when they got there, they found this, completely unfinished. Floor wasn't even smoothed, and nothing in it. So this was a decoy. Unless maybe somebody broke in a long time ago and never told anyone, we're not sure. But what he found was nothing. So he went back up, and on his way back up, he noticed a stone had fallen out of the ceiling there. That might have been what they heard when they were looking for the descending passageway. And so they investigated more closely, and they found that it actually was an opening and there was an ascending passageway. Now, the first thing they ran into going up the ascending passageway was it had been blocked with 3 huge solid granite plugs. Okay? Granite, this red hot acid business doesn't do a thing for granite. Okay? So what he had to do, he saw the first one, they had to tunnel around it into the limestone. When they got past the first one, there was a second one. So they had to tunnel around that one. When they got around that, there was a third one. They tunneled around that, and they finally got going up the ascending passageway. They found the Queen's chamber first, which was empty when he opened it, or we think he opened it. Completely empty. There's a little altar in the back there, which is actually a little bit bigger than it was originally. They tried to dig away and see if there's anything behind it, but there wasn't. But keep in mind now, all the walls and ceilings are granite. Okay? We have hard enough time understanding how they worked limestone, how they worked granite. Maybe it was the aliens. And then they went back up the ascending passageway, and it's a little bit dark here, but you come into this grand gallery, which the ceiling is higher than the ceiling in this room. And this is the first time you can actually stand up in these passageways. The other ones you had to kind of crouch over. So you can actually stand up, you go up the stairs, you have a little entryway, and then you're in the king's chamber, and this is what they found. Except for the corner worn away, that's been done by various tourists since, taking souvenirs. There was a granite sarcophagus, no lid, nothing in it. Nothing in the room except for this empty sarcophagus. Okay? So the story is, Mamun came for the secret knowledge, but of course the workers thought they were gold. That's why they were doing all this hard work. And so the story is, after the first disappointing day when they found out there was nothing inside, Mamun had one of his assistants sneak in at night and put a bunch of gold coins in there for them to find the next morning, which just about made up the wages that they would have expected for their work. Okay, so nothing. It's got this elaborate structure which they didn't really explore, but was later explored by digging holes and climbing up. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 granite slabs with spaces in between them, and then a peaked roof. All of this is to relieve the enormous weight that's on top of this room and deflect the stress to the side, away from the king's chamber to the solid structure on the side of it. Okay? And in these crawl spaces between the 5 slabs, you see things that were never meant to be seen, but there are sort of graffiti exposed on these blocks. And what the graffiti typically say, they're a signature for the gang that put this block in place. Okay? And that's very important because I wasn't quite expecting aliens, but I was expecting somebody to say that they were all slaves. And that's modern evidence is that that's really not true. In fact, they probably took great pride in what they were doing, as evidenced by the signatures of the people who were privileged to work on the actual king's chamber. But that probably extended pretty broadly. Now, if you think about it, most of the work was done during the flood season, when the farmers couldn't do anything with their land. So they were delighted to have employment during this period of time. They were housed, they were fed, yeah, they worked hard. And then on top of that, imagine this pyramid is partway built, and you're coming from a village where all you've ever seen is mud huts. And you get off the boat and you see something that was built by aliens, as far as you're concerned. So probably not slave labor. Okay, now let's nail down the astronomy here. So these shafts, the one from the king's chamber points to the pole star. Well, we've got to be careful because there's a curious, very long-term phenomena in astronomy called precession, which moves where the pole appears to be. In their time, it was not what we call the pole star, Polaris. It was some other star. But that shaft, we can figure out what that would have been because we know how precession works now. And we know that that one was pointing to the location of, let's say, the axis in the sky. Okay? The point around which everything revolves. And the shaft from the Queen's chamber also points to a particular star. And again, the southern shafts, one points to Orion, the other points to Sirius, the king and the queen of the sky, to the Egyptians. And here's a little robot gadget that was sent up these shafts to see how far they would go and if there was anything in them. And what they found was you go pretty far up so they could actually get a real good measurement of the angle and check the alignment. But they ran into a door. It was blocked. It was not open to the sky. Okay? So again, very clearly, this is not necessarily passageways for the soul, but lighting a lamp, giving a guide, something it can follow. Okay? So the Ba and the Ka go off. They head for the North Pole stars. We're going to talk a little bit about what happens there with Osiris and so on. But if everything goes well, they're able to come back. They would probably want to use these shafts as some kind of indication where they should go. and they will be reunited around the mummy. That's the idea. Okay, so here you can see Polaris. Our pole star is not at the pivot of their night sky, and the air shaft from the Queen's chamber points to Kochab, which is the Little Dipper to us, but to them it was an adze or an axe, which is a tool, a ceremonial tool that is used in the opening of the mouth to let the Ba and Ka go out right after the pharaoh dies. Okay, so here's precession. The Earth is a spinning top. And if you've ever spun a top and put it on the table, what happens? It spins around and around. Can you tell me what happens? It has an axis, and that axis will probably start to wander. And it will wander, and if it keeps spinning, if there's very low friction, it will come right back to the same place. If there's friction, that axis will gradually start to fall over and your top will fall down eventually. But that motion of the axis is an effect that you can explain by completely understanding classical mechanics. And the same thing happens to the Earth, except that the Earth is so enormous that one cycle of this moving the axis around takes 23,000 years. Okay? So in the time from when the pyramids were built to today, of 4,500 years, you've gone maybe 1/6 of the way around a full circle, and that's indicated here. Back here, it was Thuban, and then in the future, it's going to get over to Deneb, Vega, and then come back. Now, I'd just like to throw in the fact that this precession is important not just for understanding the pyramids, it's important for us for understanding our climate, because it's thought that this precession is what causes the waxing and the waning of the ice ages. Okay, so it's actually pretty complicated. There's actually 3 motions of the spinning top. One is the precession of the axis, which Ralph Abraham calls wobble, and then there's also changes in the, he calls that tilt. Then there's changes in the elliptic shape of the orbit. It gets slightly more stretched out or slightly rounder. So what happens is all these slow motions change the balance of how much sunlight falls on the northern versus the southern hemisphere. And the only reason that makes a difference is because all the land is in the northern hemisphere. If our globe were completely uniform as far as land distribution, you probably wouldn't have ice ages. So it depends on a lot of things, but just so you know, the same thing that's going to allow us to date the pyramids is still important to us today to understand. Okay, so let's go back to Osiris and Isis. Osiris was the original pharaoh who taught the Egyptians how to farm taking advantage of the annual flooding of the Nile. And because of this, he was extremely popular, but he had a brother, Set, who was jealous of Osiris and plotted to assassinate him. And he did that and cut his body up into pieces and scattered the pieces. But according to the pyramid texts, we'll see a little bit more about these. These are scrolls that relate to the customs and practices of death and burial. And the pyramid texts say that his wife Isis had a dream in which she foresaw what was going to happen. She didn't get there in time to stop it, but she picked up the body parts, put them back together, and they were sort of alive just long enough for her to conceive a child. And that child was Horus. And the goal of Horus then was to grow up and avenge the murder of his father. Sound familiar? What other famous work of literature has almost exactly the same plot? Hamlet, right? The son avenges the murder of his father by his uncle. Okay? So all through history, ancient Egyptian history, Osiris is the pharaoh who has just died, and Horus is the new pharaoh who's come to replace him. And here's an alabaster jar with the symbol of Horus, apparently holding the hieroglyph for eternity in his claws, because after he has his vengeance, they're going to be pharaohs forever, their line. Now here is an example of a papyrus scroll. It's most commonly referred to by us as the Book of the Dead, but the actual translation of the Egyptian title is the Book of Going Forth by Day. And so it's really not about the dead, it's about getting to a successful afterlife. And here's what you have to do. You have to go, well, first of all, you would go up to the stars, but then somehow you would get down to the underworld, which is ruled by Osiris now. He's died, become a god, presides over the underworld. He has a very important function in the underworld because, according to the Egyptians, when the sun sets, it goes under the earth, and then when it gets down to the very farthest point at midnight, there's an interaction between Osiris and the sun that they both draw energy from. And that energy for the sun gets it to come up and rise in the morning, and the energy for Osiris just increases his power. Okay? And his power is that he's the one who passes judgment over the souls that have just died. If your heart is weighed down with sin so that it's heavier than a feather, and thumbs down means that a big monster comes out and eats you, and that's it. No hell. No, the afterlife is over. Okay? If your heart is not weighed down, and here's an example of a successful result. The heart presumably is over here, and the feather is down there. Osiris will let you have an afterlife. Okay? And then you can go forth by day. As the sun rises, you'll be able to come out of the underworld, and if the tomb has been prepared for you properly. You can find the mummy. You can reunite the Ba and the Ka. They can take the Ka nourishment from everything that's provided, and you'll have a successful afterlife. Here's another one. This is kind of funny because, again, you have the weighing of the scale. The heart is lighter. And here's this person over here is the person who's being judged. And he's raising his arms, which we saw before is the hieroglyph for Ka. So what happens is these scrolls are prepared to be buried with a certain person, okay? And they're like a crib sheet, okay? Just remember, you're going to do this, you're going to do that, you're going to go for Osiris, you're going to have the scales, and it was buried in the tomb with the mummy. This is at a later time when you didn't have to be a pharaoh to have access to an afterlife. It gradually filtered down to the nobility and then eventually even to non-noble people. But the funny thing about this is that in this scroll that he's had prepared for his tomb, he's prejudged the outcome. He said, I'm going to pass this thing. So there it is, the crucial scene before Osiris, and he has been granted an afterlife. He will not be fed to the monster. This is kind of to throw in another aspect of astronomy, which is the pentagram, which most ancient cultures were very aware of the fact that the planet Venus appears as both the morning star and the evening star at different times in different places. Once you figure that out, you can go through the cycle of Venus and find out that Venus goes through the morning star, evening star cycle exactly 5 times in 8 years. And 5, they thought 5, wow, that's the human number, right? That's our number, 5. Okay, so they placed a great value on that, and it has not only spiritual but astronomical significance. This one I threw in just because this is a heartbreaker. This bowl is made of gneiss, or gneiss, which is harder than granite. We don't even know how they worked granite. How did they work this into a this is not put together. This is a solid piece of granite that's been carved out like this into a bowl, maybe this thick. We have no idea how they did such a thing. And now, think about the walls of the king's chamber, granite, all smooth and polished. Again, no idea how they did it. Now we're going to see some examples of funerary objects, objects that were placed in the tomb to provide the environment where the Ba and the Ka could come together and be happy as they, somewhat as they were in life. So again, it's the Ka of the food, the Ka of the clothes. Not the food itself, but the Ka of the food. So at a certain point, probably very early on, the pharaohs probably realized, well, by the time it gets to my great-great-great-great-grandson, he's not going to be bringing oranges to my tomb every day. So they realized that since it was only the Ka, they could make objects that represented the food. And if it had the right Ka, it would do just as well. Okay? So I think that's extremely important to understand about appreciating all forms of Egyptian art. First of all, the majority of it is funerary objects, funerary murals, funerary texts. The reason for that is because the Egyptians valued the afterlife above everything else. They put all their resources into the afterlife. It just so happens that their conception of the afterlife requires a simulation of their real life. And that's how we find out how they lived, because they preserved it for us in the tombs. So you've got a servant kneading bread, a potter making a pot. You've got a shepherd crossing a stream, and the way it's kind of hard to see, but here's the shepherd right here, and you kind of see he's got a little calf, he's carrying it on his back. So the cows don't want to cross the stream, so what he does is he puts the calf on his back and wades in, and then the cows will cross. Here is a Slab Stila. This is a stone wall that's been painted. This was found in Giza. The reason it looks so good is because they had a little bit of a crowding problem in these tombs. And this was originally erected for a prince. And you have all kinds of offerings, all kinds of objects here, offerings, food, incense, unguents, those are creams for either makeup or treating bad skin, eye paint, linen cloth. And please note that these things are repeated, okay? There's not just one of these things. There's a whole bunch of them, okay? This is the arithmetic mentality. You make lists. I need 5 of this. I need 6 of this. I need 3 of that. And you show them all. I'm sorry. The reason this is in such good shape is they ran out of space, and a later prince just put a stone wall right in front of this and painted it with his Slab Stila. So this was spent 4,000 years being this close to a stone wall protecting it, and that's why it looks so good. It looks like it's just fresh. Here's an expedition to catch ducks, and again, you don't just catch 1 duck, you catch 5 ducks. Here's another Slab Stila, again from Giza, this time from a princess. All these different objects that you would want to have at hand to enjoy your afterlife. Okay, and here's an indication of how things gradually became democratized. Here is the artisan who made the statues for the pharaoh making a few statues for himself. Now, the connection between the pyramids and Orion Osiris. There's a very interesting speculation that came up recently. Once we confirmed astronomically and with those robots that the shafts were pointing to Osiris and Isis, somebody came up with the notion that there are 3 pyramids in a row and there are 3 belt stars in Orion. And the way it works is the 3 belt stars in Orion, they're a nice little line, and the third one is a little bit off and a little bit fainter. And in this one you have 1, 2, 3, and it's a little bit off. Now what I've done, these black dots, I just worked in Photoshop to get the first 2 black dots to fall exactly. Those black dots are the positions of the stars, belt stars of Osiris, and if you project them onto the tombs, well, it's a kind of a miss. A little bit disappointing considering the precision they did everything else with. So you can believe this or not. But it would answer one very interesting question, which is why did Menkaure accept a much smaller pyramid than his father or his grandfather had? Well, you might think they ran out of the stone, but that's not true. We can see where the quarries are. There's plenty of stone left in the quarries. So if you believe this belt star hypothesis, the reason Menkaure accepted the smaller pyramid was he was the last one that was going to be part of this plan. Nobody else was going to have a right to do anything like this. He was the last one in the door, and so of course he would be quite happy to have a slightly smaller one because it matched the brightness of the stars. I'll just throw this in. The Orion constellation has down below the belt something called the Orion Nebula, which is modern astronomers' favorite place to go looking for how stars and planets are formed. Here's an example of a photograph of a blob of stuff that's coming together and is going to be a planet, called a protoplanetary disk. Now, I've talked about the durability of the monuments. I want to also say a word about the durability of the texts. The Egyptian texts were written on papyrus, which is a very sturdy form of paper. In the dry air of the desert, it lasts pretty well. We do have papyruses that were rolled up and put in jars and have survived for thousands of years. But they're not as durable as what the Sumerians had. The Sumerians had baked clay tablets. It's pretty hard to beat in terms of durability. So we have a lot more surviving information from the Sumerians than we do from the Egyptians, just because of the medium that they chose to work in. In fact, there are clay tablets preserved today that are actually just running tallies of a shopkeeper. They were originally meant to stay as soft clay. At the end of the day or the week, he would erase them over and start new on the same clay tablet. But for some reason, the shop got caught in a fire and these tablets were baked, and now we have them. So the reason I say that is if you look at the historians of science, they're probably going to tell you that the Sumerians were somewhat more advanced, for example, in their mathematics than the Egyptians. The Egyptians had plenty of good math. They originally discovered the 3-4-5 triangle and lots of other good things. But when somebody tells you that the Egyptians weren't quite as good as the Sumerians, what they're really saying is our evidence of what the Egyptians did doesn't show things that are quite as good as what the evidence from the Sumerians show. And if you think about it, that's not too surprising because of the durability of the media that they used, okay? And furthermore, what we have as papyrus was probably rolled up, buried in a tomb, in a jar, in a sealed jar, as a funerary object. So if it was a mathematical text, it's entirely possible that this was not the serious mathematical knowledge. This was a crib sheet in case Osiris happened to ask you, what's special about a 3-4-5 triangle? You could look it up. I'm not saying that is. I'm just saying it's a possibility that what we have surviving is very inferior to what they actually knew back then. There's another factor that contributes to the lack of durability, apart from just the aging of papyrus. All the ancient scrolls that were known in the time of the Roman Empire were probably in the library at Alexandria. Who knows what happened to the library at Alexandria? Yes? Fire, yes. Some stories say they were destroyed by a fire set by one of the Caesars when he was conquering Egypt. It's not clear that that's true. It's probably true, I'm very sorry to say, that the fire that really destroyed the library at Alexandria was set by a Christian mob about 400 AD. But in any case, a great deal was lost that was in the library of Alexandria. And now think about what happens. Okay? Your library is burned down. You've got all kinds of manuscripts. You'd like to reconstruct them if you can. If they were written in a living language, Latin, Greek, in those days, books were so rare, if it was written in a living language, there was a scholar somewhere who had memorized it, word for word. He just sat down and wrote it out again. If it was not written in a living language, there's nothing you could do. Nobody had memorized it. Nobody could reconstruct it. It's gone forever. Okay? So that's another aspect of the durability of our records of what the knowledge are. Okay? And I'd finally like to mention another quote from Herodotus, the father of history or the father of lies, who said, "There are some Greeks who have adopted this doctrine of reincarnation." This was something later in Egyptian beliefs. It wasn't the ancient pharaohs, but later on they actually adopted a form of reincarnation. Some Greeks who adopted this doctrine, some in former times and some in later times, as if it were their own invention. Their names I know, but refrain from writing down. He was talking about Pythagoras. Okay? And if you go back and read what the ancient Greeks said they got everything from Egypt. They got everything from Egypt. That's what they said. That's not what we say now, but that's what they said then. Thank you.